Good morning and welcome to a coverage of the ACT Chess Association online events. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and then produce these summaries after the event. This is a re-record of something I'd produced earlier where unfortunately sound issues caused some problems, and so I'm having another go at covering this game from the Monday night Blitz, which was played on the 11th of October 2021 between Connor and CS Robbins. Connor is one of our promising junior players in the ACT and someone I coach, while CS Robbins is a more experienced player. And it's an example of just how to play a direct attack against the king. So off we go. Connor was white. It started with e4, e5. And he played the Vienna Opening, which is an opening he's now been preparing for a little bit and has been getting good results. So knight f6 and f4. And the idea is you're playing a king's gambit, a move down, but at the same time you've developed a piece. And one of the other ideas is that in some lines of the king's gambit you've got to worry about the black queen coming across to h4, but once black has played knight f6, you don't have to. Now there are a few traps in this position. The most, I wouldn't say the most obvious one, but the one that tends to turn up earliest when you're learning this is taking the pawn. So after e5, black suddenly realised there are no safe squares for this knight apart from g8, because anything h5, g4 gets captured and e4, d5 is protected by the knight. However, black occasionally will try and put that off by playing queen e7, and because of the pin, the pawn can't take the knight. But queen e2 breaks that pin, so the knight is now under threat, and black really has to accept that they're in trouble now, so the knight goes back to g8. White continues to develop, and then d6 is a pretty huge blunder in this position. White has two good moves coming up, so knight d5 to start with attacks the queen, and when the queen goes back to d8, this is where the trap really lands. You play knight takes c7, attacking king and rook. And of course, looking at this position for the first time, you might ask yourself, why can't I just take the knight with the queen? But if you do, you lose your queen to the discovered attack. So the white queen is attacking the king on e8 with check, and the queen on c7 is under attack from the pawn. And no matter how you get out of check, including moving the queen across to e7, the pawn will take the queen next move. Instead of d6, which is a mistake, you can play knight c6 here. But d4 leads to a strong position for white. Your pawn on e5 is now happily protected. You're also about to take the pawn on f4, and you've got a very good position. The best move, and I'm not going to go into reasons why for this coverage, is d5 with very, very sharp lines, where you've got to actually really know what's going on. Instead, black played d6, which is quite passive, and does lead into lines of the bishop's opening as well. And one of the reasons why the Vienna is an attractive opening to play when you're young is because it actually covers a few different openings and you can play it in a few different ways. So knight f3 will just develop for the moment, and bishop b5 is not a bad idea here. Pin and win. And your simple threat in this position is now to capture the pawn on e5, because if you play something like bishop e7, takes and takes, and then after knight takes e5, the knight on c6 is pinned by the bishop on b5, and we can't capture back. And white has just won a free pawn. So bishop went to g4. This can be risky in a lot of lines because the bishop is almost only temporarily pinning the knight. Because after h3, what do? Do you retreat or do you capture? So after capturing, we take with the queen. The bishop went to e7, and white continued to develop. d3 is a nice move. It protects the e4 pawn and allows the bishop on c1. Now, castles now. Having castled means that the knight is no longer pinned, and the knight on c6 is threatening to go to d4 to kick the queen around for a bit. So white played the very sensible takes here and takes here. Now a lot of players, especially when they're young, avoid these captures because they've heard that having two bishops is better than not having two bishops. But in this case, white correctly realised that that knight could be a dangerous piece, so eliminating it now is a good idea. Now, I said this was a game about direct attacks. For example, white could play taking the pawn here and taking back. bishop e3, and this position is actually good for white based on the fact that the 2 pawns that I've marked, c6 and c7, can't be defended by other pawns, so white has the opportunity later in the game to try and attack them, and they have to be protected by pieces, which is not what pieces normally want to do. Pieces would rather be running around the board, threatening things, and being protected by pawns, not being tied down to protect pawns. But as I said, direct attacks is what we're looking at today. So white actually played g4, and the idea is that white is going to try and run these pawns up the board and either attack on f6 or h6 or even g6 with the pawns. One move in this position that takes advantage of the fact that black has double pawns is rook b8. Because the pawn on b7 is captured, it does give a good set of squares for that rook to operate on. And you're attacking the pawn on b2, even though it's defended now by the bishop. As I said, pieces would rather not protect pawns, and so black is attacking them, and this means that before that bishop can move, maybe the rook has to go to b1 to do that job instead. Instead, black played an exchange here, and white took, and this only really helped white because it allowed white to bring the piece out that was still sitting on c1. And now here's the first kind of big mistake that happened in the game, which was h6. But I'll just look at the alternatives first. Knight d7 is not a bad move because the bishop is now free to go to h4 with check. And after we castle, knight goes to e5 and the queen's under attack. We could swap bishop for knight, which is not a bad idea, because if we try and play something like queen g3, bishop h4, queen back here, rook b8, and this position's pretty equal. And in fact, black may be able to even whip up a little bit of counterplay by trying to sneak the queen over to this side of the board as well. So one of the important things in positions like this is sometimes you got to look for slightly more active defenses. Instead, h6 was a bit passive, and the main issue with h6 is now the pawn on g4 can go to g5 and is attacking 2 things. When the pawn was back on h7, it's actually a lot harder to open up this position. But the moment the pawn goes to h6, the pawn can go to g5, pressuring h6 with the support of the pawn and attacking the knight. This is sometimes known as a hook, as in an attacking hook in the position, and is a reason why you've just got to be careful about moving pawns in front of your king. So white continued with h4, which wouldn't have been possible if the knight had moved to d7. And again, now if the knight goes to d7, g5 can be played, and after knight e5, queen g3, h5 is actually not a bad defensive move here. It does slow down the attack. Having said that, black is giving up a pawn. So we take twice on e5, we've captured a pawn, but after bishop d6 to chase the queen around, we go to f5, the bishop goes to g3 to annoy the white king. King goes to e2, white is better, being up a pawn, but the game isn't over. Black can certainly play on for a number of moves and try and do their best to get back into the game. Instead, knight h7, which I did look at when the game was being played live, turns out not to help. At first, it looks like black has now got 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces, including pawns defending g5, while white only has 2 attacking, so it looks like an overwhelming advantage for black in terms of protecting the square. But there is an old saying that the more a player tries to prevent a move, the stronger it is when that move is played. So in this case, g5 becomes a very strong move. Because after taking and taking, we've opened the h file, which was actually white's plan. And the idea is that the rook on h1 and the queen on f3 are working together. The queen's going to go across to h5 and then try and checkmate the king. Black played their kind of final mistake here with bishop takes g5, but even after knight takes g5, a similar thing to what happened in the game takes place. Queen h5, and we're just threatening mate on h8 in this case. Black should play f6 to give an escape for the king, okay, via f7. So we go we'll take the knight first, and after pawn takes, castle's quite a good move here. Because for this attack to work, you're not going to chase the king around the board as much as you're going to try and cut off the squares that the king can run to. And so the idea is the rook is going to head across to f1 in some lines. Rook f4 to try and stop that from happening. Queen h7 and the king runs. Okay? And we play another good move, knight e2 here to chase the rook away. And black has some choices here. Rook h4 seems to be best. And after taking and taking, rook check, bishop f6, queen takes h4. And we get a position where it's back to equality. Okay, but at the same time, white is better because that king is out in the open a little bit. But again, you know, I wouldn't necessarily say this is completely lost for black, and black might have some chances. If, for example, back in this position, when the knight went back here, the rook just retreated. Knight d4 is a good move because you're now threatening to drop the knight on a very strong square on f5, and from f5 you're attacking the g7 square with the help of the queen. And if black tries to swap queens with queen g8, you can just check, drive the king backwards, take the pawn here, and even something like rook h6, you just play rook here, and after king e8, note that white's king is in danger, so you just want to retreat back to here, and then those squares are strong. The main threat in this position, by the way, is simply rook on h1, taking the rook on h6, because if the pawn takes, then the queen on g8 is undefended. But if we all played chess perfectly, chess would be boring. So instead, black went wrong with bishop takes g5, and white just lowered the boom in this position with queen h5. Suddenly, queen takes h7 is being threatened. If the knight moves, queen h8 is mate. So bishop went back to h6, but then the bishop just captured. And after the pawn took, queen takes h6, and now you're still threatening queen h7 and queen h8 if the knight moves. And at this point, black decided to fall on their sword with queen g5, hoping that maybe white wasn't paying attention, but white just played queen takes h7 mate. So a very direct attack. Basically, white's pieces just shoveled themselves across to the king side, and then using the pawns to break through, white managed to checkmate black. This game is somewhat reminiscent of me of some of the early games I've seen in Irving Chernev's logical chess move by move, even though they were obviously played by higher level players, but the principles were still the same. Get a lead in development, put your pieces on good squares, target the opponent's king with your pieces, break through with the pawns, win the game. So that was played on Monday night at ACT Chess Association online Blitz events. We run these events on Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays. My name is Sean Press. I organise these events on behalf of the ACT Chess Association and then produce these videos normally the day after. In this case, I'm producing this one a few days after, and then they're being streamed on Twitch TV and then being uploaded to YouTube. So until my next video, thanks for tuning in, and I'll be seeing you later.